Kia ora, Shaneel, and thank you so much for being part of our 10 for 10 podcast series. I wanted to start by asking you about who you are and where you're from. I understand you grew up in Fiji. That was your childhood.
Mm, yeah. Well, thank you for having me. It's really lovely to be here. Well, I was born in Fiji in 2000, which happened to be the year of Fiji's third coup, which they also called Fiji's ethnic coup. So I would have been about 4 months old. And then when I was about 6 years old, Fiji had its fourth coup. So, the country's economy was debilitated and there were international sanctions on the government at the time. So the economy was really suffering, which meant that the country was very poor. Um, and so, my upbringing very much happened in what one would describe as a lower class family. And so my dad didn't earn very much money and my mum didn't work. My mum didn't finish primary school and my dad didn't finish high school. So we grew up in a, fairly poor household. So, I find that what I often get categorized and boxed in is, someone who's queer and only really had that struggle. But I think my queerness or other people's anti-queerness didn't necessarily become a problem for me much later in life. And some of the other things, that probably affect far more people, such as poverty and risk of homelessness and having parents who are potentially addicted to substance. Those kind of things are playing into my life much sooner than the fact that I was queer. So, my childhood was difficult, but it was also, unique, and I really enjoyed most of it. I grew up in a small village in Fiji where you knew all your neighbors and you would know them by name and you would know how many kids they have. And, if you were short on something, you could always go and, like, for example, groceries, you could always go and ask your neighbor and they'd give it to you. And you attended, the temple together, the mosque or the church together. You had all your kids get on the bus in the morning and go to the same school. So I grew up in a very collectivist community and I really enjoyed that. And, there's ups and downs, but I think I had a really enjoyable childhood and there were some challenges, but I'm here today and I think I'm doing rather well. So,
Tell me about the challenges.
well, I think the first thing is because we grew up so poor, that was always on, say, my parents' mind, ensuring that we always had kind of a roof over our head. And speaking of the roof over our head, our house is made of tin and like wood and tin, and you'd have kind of wooden walls, and you'd have tin roofs. And every Fiji has cyclone season, so you get cyclones almost every year. And so in the cyclone, your roofs could potentially blow away, so you'd have to tie them down with a rope. So that was kind of like the material reality, and you'd have to budget really well to do your grocery shoppings and you pay your bills and so those kind of things were kind of always pressing issues and they were so common that they almost operated in the background. You know that everyone's thinking about it, but no one really talks about it because it's so normal, it's so common, there's no point discussing it. Um, so that was kind of, the challenge in the early years of my life. But then, I grew up in Fiji during a time where homosexuality was still a crime. I think homosexuality was a crime until I was 14. So I knew that I was queer. I didn't really understand the legal framework that was operating, but I certainly knew that it wasn't acceptable to be queer. So yeah, I tried to fit in, but I don't think fitting in was really ever for me. I once went to town, and again, we grew up in a small village, and to go to the town, you needed to get in a taxi, and so we didn't go very often. But once I went to a town, and Justin Bieber had just released his music, and so me and my sister we'd gone out to town to buy a CD with all the music. And the guy that sold us the music, well, was a bit of a fraud. So he had not only put Justin Bieber music on it, but a bunch of other stuff. And so I played it, and Telephone by Lady Gaga and Beyonce was on it. And I was like, oh, this is fascinating. And then Bad Romance by Lady Gaga was on it, and I was like, oh, this is fun. And I think it was kind of in those moments where I suddenly started realizing that you could be different, you could be a bit strange, you could be a bit weird, you could just be something that wasn't the norm, and it didn't have to be a punishable offense. What it could be is that you're unique, you're doing your own thing, and that there are people who would celebrate you for being different but yourself.
What a remarkable piece of serendipity.
Yeah.
That guy with his bootlegged CD.
Yeah. And it was very common for them to do that in Fiji.
So moving to New Zealand, you were 14. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, the first time I'd come to New Zealand was just before I was 14. I think it was around 2011, 12, and I didn't stay for very long. I've gone back, and that's kind of when I knew that I wanted to come back entirely because it was a very different world here than it was to Fiji. You can start with the very little things like the quality of the roads. And the quality of the houses dramatically different, right? So your material life, schools, housing, roads, things like that were dramatically different. When you grow up in Fiji, especially where I was growing up, a lot of people were living below what one would describe the poverty line. Making struggling to make ends meet. But then things were slightly different here, and so when I had been here once, I really, urged my parents that we've got to go. And at that point, most of my family, extended family, like my dad's siblings, my mum's siblings, my dad's parents had all moved. So it felt like a natural progression for us.
But that's a brave thing for your parents to
Yeah.
uproot and move.
Entirely, yes. I mean, I've been reflecting a lot about this weird, nostalgic experience that a lot of immigrants have. And, you kind of, your childhood is the kind of time you need stability and to be, you don't want too many changes and too many disruptions to your life. It's a time for you to be kind of shielded and protected and for you to grow. But I think for a lot of immigrants, particularly immigrants of color who come from impoverished nations, you do it not entirely by choice. You do it because you have to. And because you don't ever move 100% on your terms, there's always a sense of regret. There's always a sense of, nostalgia. So I've been feeling a lot of that. I mean, particularly at this point in my life, I was having this discussion with my friends recently, and then, you think about it, you move over and you get adapt to the new way of life, the new language, your accent changes. I didn't speak like this all my life. Now I speak very differently to when I did when I moved over. Um, and one of the main reasons for that would have been because there was a lot of racist bullying when I spoke a different way. So I had to change the way that I speak. And so you get used to the culture, you get used to the accents, you get used to, living in a very different population, demographic. Yeah. And, even when it does get better, there's always that weird sense of doesn't quite feel right, or I'm not quite sure if I fully belong here.
I read when I was reading some of the work that you'd written, I think it might have been the A Tangata essay. You
Mm,
talked about your mother and how she improved her language skills. She got a driver's license.
yes, yes.
That was really, that's a woman who takes life and shapes it.
Yeah,
That's
I
really
mean,
inspiring.
yes, I think for, when you're a teenager, it can be really easy for you to feel a bit ashamed that you don't come from an affluent, wealthy, rich, well-educated family. I think that's a very common experience for a lot of immigrants, for a lot of people who come from poor backgrounds.
Mm.
And, for me, that was the case. And it wasn't up till very recently when I just started very proudly saying, I come from a family that isn't very well educated in the colonial sense. I come from a family that not very well off, and my mum didn't finish primary school, my dad didn't finish high school, my dad now drives a truck, my mum works in a factory, and yet I'm here, and
Mm,
yet I am doing what I am doing. So,
mm,
quite clearly, despite not having all the resources needed, they did what they had to get me here.
mm,
I worked jobs and got myself through university and so on. But I think, for my parents, life would be incredibly difficult because I was young, so I could form new friendships and find new communities. But for them, all their friendships and all their community and so on was left behind. And for someone like my mom who didn't speak fluent English when moving to New Zealand, creating that new community would be really difficult because not everyone, well, very few people in this country would speak like Fiji Hindi, which is the language
mm,
that she speaks. So for her to then communicate with people here and to form that community and form friendships would have been a very difficult journey. Slightly different from my dad because he could speak English and because he works with men that a lot of men who come from either India or Fiji, and he can speak, three different languages. He can speak Fijian and Hindi and Fiji Hindi and English. So different experiences, but difficult for both of them nonetheless.
mm. And that courage, gotta applaud that.
Mm,
You mentioned accent, and I was reading about you going to Aotearoa College,
mm.
and accent was an issue right at the beginning.
It was funny enough because when you grow up in Fiji, you don't really think of English as the language to aspire to learn because you don't use it other than when you're communicating with, in school, because in schools it was a rule to speak in English. So I grew up in a family that spoke Fiji Hindi and Fijian, and there was Urdu on the TV all the time. So we learned, Fiji Hindi because my mum only spoke Fiji Hindi, and then Urdu because we watched movies on the TV, and then the dad could speak Fijian, and my village was there were lots of Fijians. I mean, so we learned those three languages before being introduced to English, and so when we were introduced to English, we spoke with an accent entirely because we had all of these other languages that we could speak, and we were trained to speak those and pronounce those words correctly. Um, and certainly, if you've got this English introduced and you've got to learn and you've got to speak it, and in Fiji, that accent doesn't really matter. But you move to New Zealand, and suddenly the fact that your culture didn't know so much about languages becomes an issue because you speak with an accent. And so I had to unlearn it, and now I speak the way that I do. But this doesn't seem to create any issues for me. But the fact that I did once speak with an accent did.
Reading about your time at Aotearoa College, you established yourself as yourself against a lot of pressure to fit in and conform, was the impression that I got from reading about those early years at the college.
Yeah, Otago College was, a, a decile one school, so what you would call the poorest of the poor, So it was one of the poorest schools that there are in the country, and the school isn't necessarily poor, but the community that attends the school is considered poor. Um, and so a lot of people in that community come from families that are similar to mine, where their parents haven't actually had an opportunity to get education and be curious about life and be worldly and get lots of experiences. They've kind of grown up in conservative communities and haven't really had the opportunity to explore beyond that. So I think that played a role in why young people in that community were also slightly conservative, is because early years of your life, you take on the values of your parents or the people that the adults around you. So I think the fact that a lot of these young people came from conservative religious families, particularly Christian families, and really religious Pacific Island families, it played a huge role in how they viewed life. I think people, as they got older, I think like year 13 of Otahuhu College was really easy for me. Um, because most of the people by that age had either become progressive or learned just to not say mean and hurtful things. But the early years, the year 9, 10, 11, at those ages, young people are unfiltered and they'll say what their parents or the adults in their life have taught them. So there was a bit of, the homophobia and the racism, and because I had an accent and so on. And I really grew into myself into the more senior years at university. Oh, sorry, at high school.
Your activism, I watched your speech when you were 19 to the Youth Parliament, and you had a very clear and articulate point of view. Tell me about developing your political perspective and your activism.
I became the youth MP for Jenny Salesa in what was that at the time called Manukau East in 2018 when I was in year 13, I believe. And 2019 was a youth parliament the year after I'd become youth MP. And they gave us an opportunity to either ask a question of a minister, to debate a piece of legislation, or to participate in a general debate. And so I said I would rather do a general debate. And there were many topics that you could really, there were any topics that you could talk about. And just a year before I'd become youth MP, I was volunteering at the Middlemore Hospital, at the reception when a church leader had come up and offered conversion therapy to me. Now, it was really in that moment when I'd realized that conversion therapy was still a legal practice in New Zealand, and I told myself that I can and must and I will ban conversion therapy. Now, I didn't quite know how I would do it. I just knew that I wanted to do it and I had to do it. So 2018 came around, I became the youth MP, and then youth parliament became the golden opportunity for me to advocate for this ban. I got up in the house and made the speech that I made, and it landed with that audience, and then it took off on social media. And then suddenly the country was talking about the issue. And so we went on to form the Conversion Therapy Action Group, and a group of five people. We worked together over 5 years to lobby, politicians and community organizations and human rights organizations to get them all to commit to a ban. And then the 2020 election really, no one was seeing a landslide of that nature coming our way when Jacinda had essentially broken MMP. So it meant that because banning conversion therapy was a Labour Party policy, and because the Labour Party had won a majority government, there was nothing really going to stop them from doing what they had promised to do. Now, the Greens and I think the Party Māori had also committed to banning conversion therapy. The only party that at first reading voted against it was the National Party, but then it became a conscience vote, and then most national MPs voted in favor of it alongside all the other parties. I think at the very end, about 8 national MPs voted against it, but then the entire House voted in favor of it. So it passed with an overwhelming majority.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary moment.
Yeah, I say to people, you just had to be there to really know what it felt like. I mean, before the Toitu Te Tiriti movement and the Treaty Principles Bill, the conversion therapy ban held the most submissions and the most petitions signed ever. So currently now it's at second after the Treaty Principles Bill, but two very valuable movements.
Mm. So when you were in year 13 and you had this experience, who helped you shape your thinking?
I, I think, my thinking was primarily shaped by, the people I grew around in Fiji, and just kind of not only seeing but experiencing the hardships, Um, things like, the fact that Winston Peters wants to define woman as female isn't keeping me awake at night, because I know that there are enough people in this country who will not buy that. However, I think successive governments have failed to alleviate things such as homelessness. Now, when I go get my hair cut at Godfather on Gusney Street here in Wellington, just outside the barber shop, there's an normally someone's sleeping rough, someone's sleeping on the street. And Wellington is windy, it's rainy, it's hellish in winter. Now, when it rains, my mind goes immediately to the people who are sleeping on the streets, who are now going to be cold and wet. They're going to freeze at nighttime. And those things kind of keep me awake at night, just knowing that there are people who are really struggling. And yesterday I was just watching a video on Instagram, and it was this elderly woman who was just sitting on the street, again, a homeless person. And I was like, this really sucks. The fact that we've got, um, the fact that over so many years, with so much money, we haven't been able to solve issues like homelessness really sucks. And so for me, a lot of that empathy was driven from the fact that I grew up in a poor household and we were at risk of, not sometimes not having a house. And I have friends who've kind of lived on the beach, because they didn't have a house growing up. So those kind of things have really formed my political view. I think ultimately it's about empathy and realizing that irrespective of, how someone's gotten into a bad position, we all kind of have a collective responsibility of alleviating the suffering of people who can't do it themselves. Um, so I think yeah, just real life experiences, and that's just one example, of what's shaped my politics. Ultimately my approach to life is that other people should be allowed to do what they want to do so long as they don't cause any harm. Um, and I think when people, particularly politicians, take on responsibilities to govern our country, they have a collective, responsibility to help people. That's what I think this is
Mm.
ultimately about.
So tell me what you're doing now. You've been at university. I understand you were doing law and arts and
Well, I went to the University of Auckland Law School, did graduated from law school. I'm currently writing a Master of Laws on treaty jurisprudence, and then I do like a regular day job as a researcher, and in the area of legislation and policy and so on. So those three things kind of keep me occupied, and I try to use my social media. I don't think I'm as present as I used to be, but when you work a day job and you're studying full time, your capacity is diminished. But then I'm also, involved in helping other people who are running their own campaigns. I think local government elections are coming up, and that's something I'm going to be potentially involved in assisting other people. I'm not running in local government, but I'm going to be assisting other people who are going to be running their campaigns. Yeah, I am a big believer, that if you want to get something done, even if you're contributing a small part, you've got to do something. Sitting on the internet and complaining about things, and
mm,
it's simply not enough in a world where the conservatives are far more organized, far more well-resourced.
mm. Yes, when you're on the other side, the amount of money and resources you have
Yeah,
isn't equal.
yeah.
Looking forward, what do you hope for in the future for yourself and the difference that you want to make?
Well, I haven't, thought too much about, where I'm going to end up. And I think that's possibly a good thing. When I had just moved to New Zealand, I didn't think that I would be in law school. I also didn't think I would be doing a Master of Laws. I also hadn't thought that I would go on to change a law before, in my early 20s, and then become Young New Zealander of the Year and write a book. And these things have come along, not necessarily because I've strategically planned for them to happen for me, but because I've just continued doing the things that I truly believe in, and these opportunities arise. And so I kind of hope that other people would kind of do similarly, if you believe in something, you act on it and you do something, and good things will come to you. Um, as for my future, I hope to finish my Master of Laws. My Master of Laws is a rather straightforward thesis. It's talking about whether the criminalization of homosexuality was a breach of the treaty, and if it was, can you take a claim to the Waitangi Tribunal to seek a settlement of that breach? Now, that is a claim that if a group of Takatapui Maori wanted to take forward, I would be very willing to assist in it. I would give over my masters, and the information that I've collected in the process of writing it as a starting base for such a claim. So I think I'd be fascinated in, um, advancing my advocacy by in through other avenues. I've done the social media, I've done the mainstream media, I've done the politics part of it, I've done legislation, and I think Waitangi Tribunal work might be fascinating in assisting others take a claim forward. And you never quite say never to anything and consider it as they come.
Well, I'll look forward to seeing what happens next, Shaneel. You've achieved so much and you're only in your mid-20s and
Blessing and a curse if I tell you, because people keep asking me. People will, when conversion therapy was banned, the first thing, people say, well, what's next? And it's like, well, must there be a next? Is this not enough? Um, but obviously, I myself may answer, no, it's not enough. But I try very, intently not to put too much pressure on myself to outdo myself. Is really the point, because I feel, I peaked really early in life. Well, maybe not peaked, but I had a jump to success really quickly, and to keep doing more than I've done, it's not only time consuming, but it can be a lot for my mental well-being if I'm not necessarily feeling like I'm doing more than I have done.
but supporting the advocacy of others is a way, I guess, of being effective without being eaten by advocacy in your own life.
Mm,
Mm. Shaneel, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
thank you.